All right, moving on then in Aurobindo to chapter 21, the Ascent of Life. In this particular video, I only want to focus on this one chapter, as what I want to do is bring in here Arthur Young, who wrote a book called, an excellent book called The Reflexive Universe, Evolution of Consciousness. Arthur Young, in contrast to Aurobindo, whereas Aurobindo is very sort of vague about his distinctions between what he calls here the three statuses of life: matter, life, and mind. He's very vague and shadowy and mystical, whereas Arthur Young was an engineer. He invented the Bell helicopter, and he has a very concrete, particular understanding. He goes into very particular ways of understanding the great chain of being and how it has evolved. And I want to compare the two models here because I think it'll be interesting. So in the chapter in the Ascent of Life begins with Aurobindo talking about Darwin's, the insufficiency of Darwin's explanation of life as simply an aggressive struggle on the part of individuals for survival. Because the whole problem with that is that it leaves out of account cooperation. Cooperation is also an important aspect amongst organisms, as for instance, the great microbiologist Lynn Margulis wrote about in her book on symbiosis and cellular evolution, where sometimes competition doesn't do it. And when there's a stalemate, then there has to be a cooperation, and you get endosymbiosis. For example, the cells, the bacteria that invented photosynthesis became taken up into our plant cells as chloroplasts. That's the part of the plant that enables it to survive through photosynthesis by gobbling up and encasing within it a smaller organism. This is now textbook science. It's not mystical theory. It's taught now in the academy. Or, for example, aerobic bacteria who handle oxygenation become taken up into the architecture of the animal cell to become that part of the animal cell which enables us to respire oxygen. And so, cooperation has also to be taken into account. And now he sort of gives, over the next few pages, and it's not a long chapter, a sort of X-ray snapshot of matter, life, and mind. And he starts with matter, and at first he says, the thing about matter is that what we have is we have something that he calls the type of matter, which is the atom. And he means that the atom is the type for all matter, in the same way that Goethe means that the leaf is the type of which every part of a plant is the transformation of the idea of leaf. I have a video on Goethe if you need to look back over at that. So for him, the atom is the type, and the atom represents the principle, the fundamental principle of aggregation. It gathers together subatomic particles and brings them together into a unity. So this is an aggregate unity that resists death. Atoms do not die. They're basically immortal unless we, nuclear fission or radioactive decay in the radioactive cases. But otherwise, it resists death and dissolution, has nothing to do with it, and is the type of matter, which is basically a sort of immortal substratum, which forms the kind of skeleton, let's say, that's my metaphor, the skeleton for the living world, the flesh that is enclosed on it. And but now Arthur Young is interesting to bring in here because Arthur Young has a sevenfold model that forms the shape of a V, which is his application of the myth, the Gnostic myth of the fall of the descent and fall and sinking and capture of the soul into matter, and then its liberation through the human activity of gnosis, which liberates the light particle and one ascends back to heaven. So he takes all this knowledge that we have of the sciences, and he looks at it in terms of this V-shaped myth of the fall, sinking, and capture of light. So we have these 7 stages, and light is the first of them. And then he has this idea that light is pure freedom, it has no mass, and it represents the principle of pure freedom. So he assigns it 3 degrees of freedom, 0 degrees of constraint. So he has this theory that as light then falls and becomes captured in matter, it loses its freedom, and only the human being can redeem it. So what happens then is that it moves down then to the second level, which is subatomic particles now, which now have lost 1 degree of freedom. And so they have 1 degree of constraint, 2 degrees of freedom, and we get subatomic particles. And then the next level down is, of course, the formation of atoms now. So we have atoms, there's another loss of a degree of freedom, and now there's 2 degrees of constraint, 1 degree of freedom with atoms, and then finally at the nadir of the fall we have molecules. So molecules are built up in polymerized chains that get ever larger and more complex, and they have no freedom whatsoever. So this is the realm of sort of Newtonian physics, let's say, the realm of absolute deterministic cause-effect, the billiard ball world, let's say. So this is the fall, sinking, and capture of light into its ultimate prison in the molecular realm. But then we have plants, animals, and humans. Plants represent a reattainment of 1 degree of freedom now. Plants have they grow straight up. They have their vertical growth gives them 1 degree of freedom that liberates them from the realm of matter. As far as Arthur Young is concerned, he's sort of, we have 5 kingdoms now, and he knew that, but he's sort of taken the 4 kingdoms of bacteria, protists, fungi, and plants and put them into 1 kingdom, which he calls the vegetable kingdom. And the plants ascend too. They have a hierarchy starting from photosynthetic cyanobacteria, let's say, and going all the way up to flowers. The flower is the ultimate production of the plant world, as Goethe has. And Jung was aware of Goethe's theory of the metamorphosis of plants. And then so we have, with animals now, which can move about in a 360-degree radius in space, we now have the reattainment of 2 degrees of freedom, and so we're losing constraint. And then finally with human beings, and especially the higher human beings, the great religious teachers, we have the reachievement of 3 degrees of freedom that light initially had, total freedom, and through the transformations of human consciousness, then light is liberated. So that's his beautiful sort of arc, what he calls the model of the arc, fall, sinking, and capture, and the liberation. It more or less corresponds to Aurobindo's model, just in a more concrete way. His 4 dimensions of matter correspond to Aurobindo's idea of matter, and then his 2 aspects of life, plants and animals, correspond to Aurobindo's life, and then the 7th, the realm of human culture, and especially spiritual human culture, corresponds to what Aurobindo means by mind. However, I would say that for both of them, in the case of mind, which Aurobindo is rather vague about in many ways, and also the 7th level of what Jung calls dominion, which is the realm of human culture and consciousness. He's pretty vague about that. I don't think he was very well grounded in the study of human culture. And for both of them, you would have to plug in Jean Gebser to flesh out, in that case, just as I'm doing here by plugging Arthur Young into Aurobindo's very vague descriptions of matter and life, making them much more concrete. You'd have to bring in Gebser for mind and for the 7th level for Arthur Young. And then with respect then to matter, while we're still in the discussion of Aurobindo's idea of the atom as the type of matter, matter itself has these 4 dimensions for Arthur Young then. It's light, subatomic particles, atoms, and molecules. And then each one of these going across the board also has 7 transformations that recapitulate this 7-fold arc of ultimate freedom and then the reattainment of ultimate freedom, bondage and then freedom. Light has 7 types too. We have cosmic rays, which would correspond to light itself on the model, where it's at, absolute freedom. So we have cosmic rays, and then we have gamma rays, and then we have X-rays, and then we have, then the visible spectrum. So the visible spectrum corresponds, that's the 4th, which corresponds on the model to molecules, which is the realm of the 4th, the realm of combinations of things. And it's the only realm that we can see, the visible spectrum. It's the only one on the spectrum that is visible to us, which is then followed, of course, by microwaves, and then TV and radio waves, and then finally long-wave radio. Particles, he doesn't do this. It's the only one that he doesn't do this for. He leaves it blank, going across the way there. I'm not sure why. Maybe he didn't think that it fit the model. But with atoms, then, we have, then, of course, the periodic table of the elements. And each one of these levels has its own property. The level of light is freedom, and the level of particles is bondage, things binding and aggregating together, exactly like Aurobindo's atom as an aggregate unity. Although for the atom now we have identity. Because now, with respect to the periodic table of the elements, they are organized in terms of 7 strata. It goes 7 down and 18 across, and it moves and proceeds in terms of the least simple, hydrogen atoms, which are the oldest and most common, and helium, and then goes down from there to more and more complex types of atoms. And each one has its own identity now. Hydrogen has an identity, an atomic weight that is very different from oxygen or nitrogen, and so forth. So this is the periodic table of the elements, which fits his stratum of the 7 levels, and then we have molecules, and for molecules then we have the 7 repeat as metals, salts, and what's he got here? He's got non-functional compounds, functional compounds, non-functional polymers. That's the principle of chains, the creating of polymerization into chains and combinations, and then functional polymers, and then finally with DNA we have the maximum. With DNA we almost have the beginnings of the re-achievement of the animal world of freedom now, on the way to the next level, which would then be to the level of life. And so that puts some flesh on the bones of Aurobindo's model here of matter, and his idea of atom as the type. I suppose we could still think of the atom as the type, the self sort of principle of individualization, the first principle of individualization that appears in his cosmic process. And then we have life. And then so he says that with life now, in opposition to matter, and let's say the atom, which resists death and dissolution and is fundamentally stable, we could say that the atom is a stable aggregate, whereas life now is an unstable aggregate and gives way to the process of dissolution. Everything about life is that it is always dissolving. The physical body is dissolved and eaten up by other beings. But it's also the case in terms of mental consciousness. We're constantly interacting with other beings. Our consciousnesses are constantly dissolving through things like love and the formation of human communities and aggregates of human communities, which are unstable because the individual ego is always having to give itself up and dissolve. When you're reading another man's works, his thoughts are coming your way. You are absorbing them into your organism like mental food. And so the principle of dissolution now is the main thing about life. And so it has this twofold arc. It has Darwin's idea that the individual has to preserve itself, but then we also have this idea that in the same process there is this, let's say, erotic aspect to life as well. Preservation of self is priority number 1. Preservation of the species through sexual reproduction is primary number 2. The second involves, again, a dissolution. Bits and pieces of the individual that go into other individuals that absorb the genes, let's say, and create communities that are held together through forms of help, bondage, love, compassion. We're constantly giving away pieces of ourselves on the life plane. But then he says, with regard to the emergence of mind now, then with mind we do get more of this emphasis on the formation of communities through love. These two principles are held in balance then, the principle of stable aggregation and unstable aggregation, the protection of the individual versus the giving away of the individual through dissolution, are held in perfect balance at the level of mind. And the more sophisticated and civilized it gets, the more stable human societies become through human bonding, through the sharing of thoughts and ideas and the creation of communities. And the two are in a perfect bonding. And the type then for, the type for that he gives for the level of life is simply, he says, the consciousness of limitation and the struggle to possess, to master both self and not self, is the type of the secondary status, that is the life itself. So the possession of self and not self. Whereas the type of the third level mind is love itself, which he describes here. He says, the development to the third status brings a transformation of the original terms into a fulfillment and a harmony, which repeat the terms while seeming to contradict them. There comes about through association and through love a recognition of the not self now, whereas at the status of life, the not self is seen in a hostile way as something to be devoured and eaten and conquered. Here, a recognition of the not self as a greater self, and therefore a consciously accepted submission to its law and need, which fulfills the increasing impulse of aggregate life to absorb the individual. So at the level of mind, the individual is gradually absorbed into ever larger and larger, as civilizations develop along, ever and larger unities which absorb the individual into them. First the tribe, then the family, then the village, then the town, then the city. Now the planet, the entire fucking globe, is now a universal aggregate in which the individual is absorbed. And so This leads Aurobindo to suspect, and I think rightly here, that mind then is on the way toward evolving to a fourth status, the supermind, and the descent of the supermental, which will at some point come down. It's implicit in everything because we have seen that the supermind is really the creator of the world. It has created everything that is. It's the instrument of God, Brahman, Satchidananda, to create everything. But it can be brought down, and Aurobindo's yogic practices were about doing this. And the thing about Aurobindo is that he achieved the status of a yogi. He was able to develop siddhis, which are the powers that yogis develop. He was able to develop them through concentrated, what we would call yogic experiments. So he was always undergoing these yogic experiments. One time he was able to fast for 23 days, went 23 days with no food, and he said he did not experience a diminishment of energy whatsoever. The only problem was he was losing too much weight. And so he had to stop at that point because he didn't want to just waste away. Kind of like the Buddha did when he tried the same thing and wasted away and realized this isn't the way to illumination and enlightenment. But it was something that he did. He also went 10 days without sleep when he was in jail. He had been put in jail for being a political revolutionary, starting the independence movement in India. Went 10 days without sleep there through practicing yoga. And so he proved to himself basically that it is possible for the human body to both A, go without sleep, and B, go without food through the intense application of yoga. And so I believe he performed some other siddhis, and he regarded siddhis as real things. They're not metaphors. There was one account, he has this other aspect to the physical world, which he calls the subtle physical world. So the physical world has a subtle aspect to it, which enables things like astral travel. Astral travel and the performance of these kinds of miracles, it was a real thing for Aurobindo. He remembered, there's somewhere in one of the books that I encountered an individual, a kid who had astral traveled out of his body, and he was in conjunction with the mother who was helping him, and he astral traveled out of his body, and he almost couldn't figure out how to get back into it until the mother helped him, sort of pulled him back down almost by an umbilical cord. So things like remote viewing, precognition, all these things are real in Aurobindo's universe. He's experienced all of them through spending his entire life concentrating on yoga. And so for him, the ultimate goal of all this is to bring the supermental down into the cells, into the physical body, and to transform the physical body, basically to transubstantiate it. The same way the Catholic priest calls down the spirit, the word, the logos that takes up in the wine and the wafer. The wine becomes the blood of Christ and the wafer becomes the body of Christ, but symbolically. The idea is that their outer phenomenal forms don't look any different to your physical senses, but their substances have been transubstantiated. They're now like magical substances, the body and blood of Christ. Except that here, Aurobindo is doing something similar with the descent of the supermental, transubstantiating the physical body, and he hopes that in establishing a precedent for the reality of doing this, that it will then make it easier for other individuals to do it in the future and to bring this about and collectively as a species actually bring the supermental down into the human body and change our physical form. Cities might become real things, average everyday things taken for granted. This is not a regression of consciousness back to the magical structure. That's important to understand and highlight here. The supermental consciousness structure for Aurobindo is brand new. It's a unique thing. It has never happened before. It isn't the achievement of the union of Atman with Brahman and the fusion with Brahman to create Brahmatman and get rid of the personal being. That's not what this is about. The personal being is retained and the supermental is brought down. Aurobindo is very concrete about his yoga. He's not interested in sailing away into realms of samsara. If he does that, it is for the purpose of bringing down more of these powers for use on the physical plane for the benefit of humanity, and to realize on the earthly plane the divine joy, bliss, and beauty of Satchidananda. He thinks that the human being will become more and more an accurate mirror and reflection of the being on the other side, the Satchidananda being. So that's the whole goal of his yoga for him. So it's very important to understand that about him. Okay, so we'll stop there with that analysis of this short chapter.